when a single unarmed medic stands between 500 charging enemy soldiers and his wounded brothers in arms. What separates survival from slaughter? This is the story of one man who answered that question with nothing but courage, morphine, and an unbreakable oath to save lives. April 29, 1945. The Apennine Mountains of northern Italy. The Gothic line, Hitler's last desperate fortress guarding the Po Valley, was crumbling under the weight of the Allied spring offensive. But in this chaos of collapsing empires and dying regimes, one American medical corpsman would face a test that no training could prepare him for. His name was Private First Class Daniel Morrison, 10th Mountain Division, and in the span of 14 hours, he would redefine what it meant to be a battlefield medic. This is his story. The 10th Mountain Division was America's elite alpine warfare unit, specially trained soldiers, capable of fighting in the most brutal terrain imaginable. Reformed in 1943 at Camp Hale, Colorado, these men were skiers, climbers, and mountaineers, transformed into warriors. April 1945, they had been grinding through the Italian mountains for months, facing not just the Wehrmacht, but nature itself. Private First Class Daniel Morrison wasn't supposed to be there. A 23-year-old from Burlington, Vermont. Morrison had been a pre-med student before the draft notice arrived, in 1943, slight of build at just 5'9" and 160 pounds. He didn't fit the rugged profile of the mountain troops. But what Morrison lacked in physical presence, he compensated for with an almost obsessive dedication to his medical training. His company commander, Captain James Hendricks, would later write that Morrison knew every man's blood type by heart and could spot shock symptoms from 20 yards away. The strategic situation in late April 1945 was paradoxical. Germany was dying, Berlin was encircled, Hitler cowered in his bunker, and the Reich was fragmentally into chaos. But the German forces in Italy, under the command of General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, remained formidable and fanatically determined. The Gothic line, stretching across the Apennines from La Spezia to Rimini, represented the last major defensive barrier before the Po Valley and the industrial heart of northern Italy. The 10th Mountain Division's objective was Mount Castello and the surrounding ridge systema, series of jagged peaks that dominated the approaches to Highway 64 and the town of Vergato. If the Allies could break through here, they would unhinge the entire German defensive line. But the Germans knew this too. They had fortified every cave, every boulder field, every ridgeline with machine gun nests, mortar positions, and interlocking fields of fire. Morrison's unit, Company B, 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment, had been fighting continuously for 6 days. They had climbed cliffs under fire, cleared bunkers with grenades and flamethrowers, and pushed the Germans' backyard by Bloody Yard. By April 28th, they had secured an exposed forward position on a razorback ridge the men simply called the Spine, a narrow stretch of rock barely 30 yards wide with sheer drops on both sides. The position offered commanding views of the valley below, but it was also a death trap. Supply lines were stretched thin, ammunition was running low, and the nearest friendly units were more than a mile away across broken terrain. Captain Hendricks established his command post in a cluster of shattered pines at the southern end of the Spine. Morrison set up his aid station in a shallow cavern, just an overhang in the rock face about. 50 yards north of the CP, it wasn't much. Some blankets, his medical kit, a dozen stretchers, and whatever morphine and sulfa powder he had managed to carry up the mountain, but it would have to do. The men of Company B had been mauled. Of the 142 soldiers who had started the offensive 6 days earlier, only 87 remained combat effective. 23 were dead, and the rest were wounded or missing. Fatigue had become a physical presence. Men fell asleep standing up, stumbled over flat ground, and stared into space with hollow eyes. Morrison himself hadn't slept more than 3 hours in the past 72. On the evening of April 28th, intelligence reports filtered up from division. German radio intercepts suggested something big was coming. Units from the 232nd Infantry Division and remnants of the 94th Infantry Division were reportedly massing in the valley below. Prisoner interrogations confirmed what everyone feared. The Germans were planning a major counterattack. They intended to retake the Spine and use it as a springboard to roll up the entire American advance. Captain Hendricks called his platoon leaders together as the sun set behind the peaks. "They're coming tonight or tomorrow morning," he told them quietly. "You hold this ridge or a lot of good men will have died for nothing. Check your fields of fire, redistribute ammunition, and get your men as much rest as you can. And for God's sake, take care of the wounded. Morrison's already worked miracles up here. Little did they know just how miraculous Morrison's work was about to become. The night of April 28th passed in tense, exhausted vigilance. German artillery probed the American positions sporadically, a few rounds here. A brief barrage there, keeping the men on edge but never committing to a full bombardment. Morrison moved through the darkness, checking on wounded men. Changing dressings by flashlight shielded with his jacket, dispensing the last of his aspirin to men with pounding headaches from altitude and stress. Private Eddie Kowalski, a machine gunner from Chicago with a shrapnel wound in his shoulder, gripped Morrison's arm as he finished bandaging. "Doc, if things go bad tomorrow, you get out first, you hear me? You're worth more than any 10 of us." Morrison smiled tightly. "Don't leave until the last man is out, Eddie. You know that?" "Yeah, Doc. That's what I'm afraid of." Dawn broke over the Apennines at 0547 hours on April 29th. The sky was crystalline blue, the air sharp and cold at this altitude. For a few precious moments, the war seemed distant. Then, at 0615 hours, all hell broke loose. The German artillery barrage came without warning, a thunderous, earth-shaking concentration of fire that turned the spine into a landscape from hell. 105mm howitzers, 150mm guns, and the dreaded Nebel Warfare rockets, the screaming Mimis, pounded the American positions with methodical fury. The shallow foxholes and rock sungers that had seemed adequate the night before now became death traps as shells burst in the air, sending red-hot shrapnel slicing through flesh and bone. Morrison's aid station cave became a magnet for the wounded. Within the first 10 minutes of the barrage, 7 men had been dragged or had crawled to his position. A private named Johnson had lost his right leg below the Nemerison, applied a tourniquet with shaking hands, his ears ringing from the constant explosions. Corporal Martinez had a sucking chest wound that bubbled with each labored breath. Morrison sealed it with petroleum jelly gauze and prayed it would hold. Sergeant Dawson had taken shrapnel across his back and couldn't feel his legs, a spinal injury that Morrison could do nothing about, except inject morphine and whisper reassurances. The barrage lasted 43 minutes. When it finally lifted at 0658 hours, 22 men from Company B were dead or wounded. The defensive positions were cratered and torn. Machine gun nests had been collapsed, communication wires severed, and the carefully prepared fields of fire obscured by smoke and rock dust. Captain Hendricks, bleeding from a gash across his forehead, stumbled to Morrison's position. "How many can fight, Doc?" Morrison looked at the 14 wounded men now crowding his cave. "These men are out of action, sir. Some of them need evacuation immediately, or they'll die." Hendricks nodded grimly. "The radio's dead. I'm sending runners to regiment, but it's going to be hours before we get any support up here. We'll have to hold them together, Morrison." "Yes." At 0710 hours, the German infantry began their assault. They came out of the morning mist like gray Gosfeld-Weibels and Obergrenadiers of the 232nd Infantry Division. Veterans of the Eastern Front who had learned their brutal trade in the meat, grinders of Stalingrad and Kursk. These weren't green recruits or old men from Volkssturm units. These were professional soldiers who knew their business. Lieutenant Rousseau, commanding the forward platoon, saw them first. Contact front. 500 yards and closing. Jesus Christ, there must be hundreds of them. The Americans opened fire with everything they had left. M1 Garands cracking in measured semi-automatic rhythm. Browning automatic rifles stuttering in controlled bursts. The heavy .30 caliber machine guns traversing back and forth across the approaching enemy. The Germans went to ground, but they didn't break. They'd done this 1,000 times before. Small unit tactics perfected through years of war, covering fire and movement. Squad rushes supported by MG-42 machine guns that ripped out 1,200 rounds per minute. Morrison watched the battle develop from his cave, his stomach tight with fear. The wounded men who could still think clearly knew what was happening. If the Germans broke through, they would be overrun. Wounded prisoners weren't a priority for troops in the middle of an assault. They would be ignored at best, shot at worst. By 07 for 5 hours, the Germans had closed to within 200 yards. The volume of fire was apocalyptic. The MG-42s had a distinctive sound, like ripping canvas amplified 1,000 times. Their sustained fire was beginning to suppress the American positions. Morrison could hear Lieutenant Rousseau shouting for ammunition, his voice cracking with strain. Then the first American position fell. Second Squad's foxhole on the eastern edge of the spine was overrun in a sudden rush. Morrison heard the grenades detonating, the brief crescendo of close quarters shooting, then silence. 3 more men from that squad came stumbling back toward his position. One of them dragging a shattered arm, another with his face a mask of blood from a scalp wound. Morrison pulled them into the cave. Lie down, let me see." He worked with frantic efficiency, his hands steady, despite the fear coursing through him. Tourniquet on the arm, pressure bandage on the head, morphine for both. He was running low on everything. Only 6 syrettes of morphine left, bandages down to the emergency reserves, plasma nearly gone. At 08 to 0 hours, Captain Hendricks appeared again, his time supporting Lieutenant Rousseau, who had taken a burst from an MG-42 across his left side. Rousseau's uniform was soaked with blood, his face gray with shock. "I need you forward," Hendricks said, his voice tight. "We've got men down all along the line and no way to bring them back." Morrison looked at the wounded men in his cave, now 23 of them, some unconscious, some moaning, all depending on him. Then he looked at Hendricks. "Sir, if I leave these men, some of them will die. If you don't help the men forward, all of us will die." Morrison grabbed his medical kit. "I'll do what I can, sir." What happened next would become the stuff of legend. Private First Class Daniel Morrison crawled forward into hell itself. The spine had become a twisted landscape of smoke, blood, and shattered rock. Bodies lay crumpled in foxholes. Wounded men called out for help, their voices weak and desperate. And everywhere, the sound of German voices growing closer, their assault building in intensity. Morrison found Private Kowalski first, the machine gunner from Chicago who had told him to run if things went bad. Kowalski was lying behind his gun, which had been struck by a mortar fragment and rendered useless. A piece of shrapnel the size of a dinner plate had torn through his abdomen. Morrison knew immediately that this was a fatal wound. Intestines were exposed, the abdominal cavity contaminated. Kowalski had maybe an hour, perhaps 2, but Morrison didn't tell him that. Instead, he injected morphine, covered the wound as best he could, and gripped Kowalski's hand. "Hang on, Eddie. We're getting you out of here. You're a terrible liar." "Fuck," Kowalski whispered, managing a ghost of a smile. "Go help someone you can actually save." Morrison's throat constricted, but he nodded and moved on. The next hour became a blur of impossible choices and desperate measures. Morrison crawled from position to position, completely exposed to German fire, dragging wounded men to whatever cover he could find. He used his last 3 morphine syrettes on men screaming from traumatic amputations. He fashioned tourniquets from belts and rifle slings. He packed wounds with torn pieces of uniform when his bandages ran out. He held pressure on severed arteries with his bare hands, his fingers slippery with blood. At 0935 hours, the Germans launched their second major push. They had worked their way around the eastern flank and were now attacking from 2 directions simultaneously. The defensive perimeter contracted violently. Captain Hendricks, now wounded in both legs, had maybe 30 men still capable of fighting. The rest were dead, wounded, or had exhausted their ammunition. Morrison was working on Corporal Chen, a radio man with a sucking chest wound, when the German assault wave swept over their position. Suddenly there were German soldiers everywhere, Feldwebels with MP-40 submachine guns, Oberge Fretters hurling stick grenades, all screaming and firing in the chaos of close combat. An American soldier, Morrison never learned his name, killed 3 Germans with his rifle before being cut down himself. A German soldier burst around a boulder, saw Morrison crouched over Chen, and raised his MP-40. The 2 men locked eyes for a single frozen second. Morrison raised his hands slowly, his palms covered in Chen's blood. "Senator," he shouted, using the German word for medic. "Senator, verwundet." The German soldier's finger tightened on the trigger, then his eyes flicked to the Red Cross armband on Morrison's sleeve, barely visible beneath the grime and blood. For another endless second, the German weighed his orders, his training, and perhaps his humanity. Then he lowered the weapon slightly and barked in broken English, "You, down." Morrison shook his head emphatically, pointing at Chen. "He dies if I stop. Verwundet." More German soldiers arrived. A Feldwebel sergeant pushed through, his face hard beneath his coal scuttle helmet. He looked at Morrison, at Chen, at the cluster of wounded American soldiers in the shattered positions around them. His expression was unreadable. Senator Morrison repeated desperately, "Geneva Convention. I'm a medic. These men need help." The Feldwebel said something sharp in German to his men, then looked back at Morrison. "You help wounded Deutsch wounded too?" "Yes." Morrison didn't hesitate. "Yes. Anyone who needs help." The Feldwebel nodded curtly and barked orders. The German soldiers spread out, securing the position but miraculously not firing on the wounded Americans. Morrison realized with stunning clarity what had just happened. The Germans had taken this section of the spine, but they were going to let him continue working. It was 0958 hours. The battle still raged 50 yards away, but in this small pocket of devastation, an unofficial truce had spontaneously emerged, built on nothing more than mutual recognition of the medic's sacred duty. Morrison worked on Chen for another 10 minutes, stabilizing the chest wound as best he could. Then he moved to the next American casualty, and the next. True to his word, when a young German soldier was brought to him with a leg wound struck by fragments from an American grenade, Morrison treated him with the same care he gave his own men. The German Feldwebel watched this with what might have been approval. He assigned 2 of his men to help Morrison move the wounded to better cover. For a surreal 20-minute period, American and German soldiers worked side by side, carrying stretchers and hauling injured men out of the line of fire. But this fragile peace couldn't last. At 10:34 hours, American artillery finally arrived, TD-1mm mortar from positions 2 miles back, firing danger-close missions on coordinates called in by Captain Hendricks before the radio had died. The shells began impacting on the northern section of the spine, where German troops were still pushing forward. The Feldwebel shouted orders. His men grabbed their weapons and moved out, returning to the battle. But before he left, the German sergeant looked at Morrison one last time. He said something in German. Morrison didn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable. Respect. Perhaps even admiration. Then the Germans were gone, moving forward into the smoke and chaos, and Morrison was alone again with the wounded. The American artillery barrage slowed the German advance, but couldn't stop it. The 232nd Infantry Division had committed over 500 men to this assault, and they were determined to retake the spine regardless of cost. By 11:15 hours, Captain Hendricks had pulled his remaining effectives now down to just 17 men back to the command post position. They were completely surrounded on 3 sides. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Several men were down to their last magazines. Morrison had somehow made it back to his aid station cave, dragging and carrying 12 wounded men with him. The cave was now packed with 37 casualties, men with missing limbs, shattered bones, perforated organs, traumatic brain injuries. The floor was slick with blood. The air smelled of copper, cordite, and fear. Morrison had no morphine left. Plasma. Bandages were down to strips torn from the dead men's uniforms. He had been working for more than 5 hours straight, and he was nearing collapse himself. His hands shook from exhaustion and adrenaline. His vision blurred at the edges. Captain Hendricks, still commanding despite 2 leg wounds and a shrapnel injury to his shoulder, fired his M1 carbine until it ran dry, then drew his .45 pistol. He killed 2 German soldiers at point-blank range before taking a burst from an MP-40 that spun him around and dropped him to his knees. Lieutenant Chen, who had taken command of 2nd Platoon after Russo was wounded, held his position until a stick grenade landed in his foxhole. The explosion killed him instantly and wounded 2 more men nearby. By 12:05 hours, the Germans had overrun the command post. The battle for the spine was over. Company B, 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment, had been destroyed as a fighting force. But in his cave, surrounded by wounded men, Daniel Morrison refused to accept defeat. German soldiers appeared at the mouth of Morrison's cave, their weapons raised, their faces hard with the killing fury of combat. Morrison stood up slowly, placing himself between the soldiers and his patients. His uniform was so soaked with blood that his medical insignia was barely visible. His hands were raised, but his eyes were steady. Sanatori said clearly, "I am a medic. These men are wounded and cannot fight." Under the Geneva Convention, silence, barked a German officer, pushing through his men. This was Hauptmann Captain Friedrich Weber of the 232nd Infantry Division's 7th Company. Weber was a veteran of the Russian front, his face scarred by frostbite, his eyes reflecting the exhaustion of too many years at war. He looked at the cave full of wounded Americans, then at Morrison standing defiantly before them. "You are prisoner," Weber said, in heavily accented English. "All wounded are prisoner. They need medical care," Morrison replied. "Immediate medical care. They don't get it, at least 10 of these men will die in the next few hours." Weber's expression didn't change. "This is war. Men die." Morrison took a step forward. "These men have surrendered. They are prisoners of war and entitled to medical treatment under international law. You know this?" For a long moment, Weber simply stared at him. The German captain had probably killed dozens of men that morning. He had lost soldiers to Morrison could see the blood on Weber's uniform that wasn't his own. Whatever compassion Weber might have possessed had been burned away in the crucible of the Eastern Front. But then something unexpected happened. Captain Hendricks, bleeding and barely conscious, was dragged to the cave entrance by 2 German soldiers. Weber looked down at the American officer, then back at Morrison. "This is your commander?" Weber asked. Yes. Weber barked an order in German. One of his men brought a canteen and handed it to Morrison. Weber pointed at Hendricks. You care for him? Morrison knelt beside Hendricks, whose breathing was shallow and rapid, classic signs of shock from blood loss. The wounds in Hendricks' legs were still bleeding, and the shrapnel in his shoulder had likely punctured a lung. Morrison worked quickly, using the last of his proper bandages to pack the wounds, fashioning pressure dressings from torn fabric. As he worked, he talked not to Hendricks, but to Weber. Captain, you have wounded men too. I heard your soldiers calling for help during the battle. Let me help them. Let me help all of them. Weber said nothing, but he didn't order Morrison to stop. Morrison continued, I'm a medic. I took an oath to save lives. American, German, it doesn't matter. It's a wounded soldier is just a wounded soldier. So let me do my job, and I'll treat your men with the same care I give mine. Still, Weber was silent. Morrison finished with Hendricks and moved to the next wounded American without waiting for permission, then the next, and the next. All under Weber's watchful gaze. Finally, after 10 minutes, Weber spoke. You are very brave, or very foolish. Morrison looked up from the man he was bandaging. Maybe both, sir. But these men trusted me to take care of them. I won't let them down. Weber considered this. Then he called out in German, and several of his men appeared, carrying or supporting wounded German soldiers. There were 8 of them men hit by American fire during the assault, some seriously injured. You help these men, Weber ordered. Then we see. Morrison didn't hesitate. He moved to the first German casualty, a young soldier, probably not even 20, with a terrible leg wound from an M1 Grand round. Morrison cut away the field gray uniform trousers and assessed the damage. The femoral artery was nicked, but not severed. The soldier would live if the bleeding could be controlled. Morrison applied a tourniquet and pressure, then moved to the next German soldier. For the next hour, Private First Class Daniel Morrison became the only doctor for 45 men, 37 Americans, and 8 Germans, all wounded, all in desperate need of care. He had almost nothing to work with, no more morphine, no plasma, barely any bandages, but he had knowledge, and he had hands that could stop bleeding. And he had a voice that could calm frightened men who thought they were dying. He moved from patient to patient in a careful triage pattern, immediate life-threatening injuries first, then serious wounds that could deteriorate, then the stable cases that just needed monitoring. He worked in German and English, his medical knowledge transcending language barriers. When he ran out of bandages entirely, he tore up his own uniform shirt. When he needed cloth for padding, he used blankets from the dead. Captain Weber watched all of this with an expression that slowly transformed from suspicion to something approaching awe. Here was an enemy soldier, unarmed and helpless, caring for German wounded with the same dedication he showed his own men. It was something Weber hadn't seen in a long time, perhaps something he had forgotten existed in this brutal war. At 13:30 hours, the sound of artillery began again, but this time, it was German artillery, defensive fire to break up an American counterattack that intelligence suggested was forming in the valley. Weber received a radio message and his expression tightened. American reinforcements were coming. The 10th Mountain Division was sending fresh companies to retake the spine. Weber looked at Morrison, then at the cave full of wounded men. He made a decision that would cost him his command and nearly cost him his life. He said to Morrison in his broken English, I leave guards. They protect wounded yours and mine. You continue work. When your soldiers come, you tell them. The wounded are under protection. No shooting in this place firsthand. Understand? Morrison straightened up, stunned. You're leaving guards to protect the wounded? Both sides? This is correct, Weber said stiffly. War is for soldiers who can fight. These men, he gestured at the cave, they fight enough. Now they live, if God wills it. Weber assigned 4 of his men to remain at the aid station to Germans, and remarkably, he ordered 2 of Morrison's lightly wounded Americans to assist as well, despite them technically being prisoners. He gave them explicit orders in German and English. No one was to be harmed. The aid station was neutral ground. Any soldier from either side who needed medical attention was to be allowed through. Then Captain Weber did something that Morrison would remember for the rest of his life. The German officer came to attention and gave Morrison a formal salute, something rarely given between enemies, something that recognized not rank but honor. You are a good soldier, Senator, Weber said quietly. Perhaps when this is finished, we'd all be human again. Veal GLCK, good luck. Then he was gone, taking his men north to prepare defenses against the coming American counterattack. Morrison stood in the cave entrance, watching the Germans withdraw. Round him, wounded men from both armies lay in the dim light, their blood mixing on the cave floor, their moans of pain indistinguishable by nationality. I had saved 37 American lives so far, and 8 German lives. 45 human beings who would have died if he had given up, if he had run, if he had placed his own survival above his sacred duty. But the day wasn't over yet. At 14:45 hours, the American counterattack hit the spine with overwhelming force. 2 fresh companies from the 85th Mountain Infantry Regiment, supported by artillery and air support, smashed into the German positions. The battle was fierce, but brief. The Germans, having suffered massive casualties in their morning assault, couldn't hold against this fresh onslaught. As American soldiers swept back onto the spine, several advanced toward Morrison's cave, weapons ready, expecting German defenders. But they found instead something that stopped them cold. Private First Class Morrison standing at the cave entrance, his bloody hands raised. With 4 soldiers, 2 German, 2 Americans standing beside him, all of them marked with red crosses fashioned from torn cloth. "Cease fire," Morrison shouted. "This is an aid station. We have wounded Americans and Germans. Cease fire." American platoon leader, Lieutenant Kowalski, no relation to the machine gunner, approached cautiously. "Who the hell are you, Private?" "PFC Morrison, sir. Medic, Company B, 86th Regiment. I have 37 wounded Americans in this cave who need immediate evacuation, along with 8 German prisoners who also need medical attention." Kowalski looked at the cave, at the guards, at Morrison standing there soaked in blood but somehow still functioning. "Jesus Christ, son. What happened here?" Morrison's legs finally gave out. He sat down heavily, his back against the cave wall. "I just did my job, sir," he said quietly. "Just did my job." The evacuation of Morrison's aid station took 3 hours and required every available stretcher bearer in the battalion. The 37 wounded Americans, 31 survived to reach the field hospital, an unprecedented survival rate for men who had sustained such severe injuries in such primitive conditions. 6 died during evacuation or shortly after reaching surgery, their wounds simply too catastrophic to survive despite Morrison's best efforts. All 8 German wounded also survived and were evacuated to POW hospital facilities, where they received the same medical care as Allied soldiers. Company B, 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment, had suffered catastrophic losses in the battle for the spine. Of 142 men who began the offensive 6 days earlier, 43 were dead and 52 were wounded, a casualty rate of 67%. The company would be pulled off the line for rest and refit, not returning to combat before the Germans' surrender on May 2, 1945. Captain James Hendricks survived his wounds, though his injuries ended his combat career. He would spend the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen about the medic who saved his life and the lives of dozens of his men. Private First Class Eddie Kowalski, the machine gunner from Chicago who had told Morrison to run if things went bad, died of his wounds at 15:20 hours on April 29th. Just minutes after American medics reached him. Morrison sat with him at the end, holding his hand. "You were wrong, Doc," Kowalski whispered with his final breath. "You should have run." "No, Eddie," Morrison replied, tears streaming down his face. "I was exactly where I was supposed to be." The German perspective on that day's battle emerged years later during historical research. Captain Friedrich Weber had indeed been court-martialed by his superiors for leaving wounded men guarded instead of executing them, or leaving them to day a charge of dereliction of duty in the face of the enemy. However, the court-martial never completed. Weber was killed in action on May 1, 1945, during the final German defensive actions of the Italian campaign, just hours before the surrender. His decision to honor Morrison's protection of the wounded died with him, known only to his men. Those German soldiers who survived the war carried the story with them. In 1983, one of the German guards Weber had left at Morrison's aid station, a former Obergefreiter named Hans Müller, traveled to the United States specifically to meet Morrison. The 2 elderly men embraced like brothers, tears flowing freely as they remembered that terrible, transcendent day when humanity had pierced through the brutality of war. "You showed us that mercy still existed," Müller told Morrison through an interpreter. "In 4 years of war, I saw so much death, so much hate. But you and Enema, you treated our wounded like they were your own brothers. You gave us hope that the world could be good again." Private First Class Daniel Morrison was recommended for the Medal of Honor by Captain Hendricks and every surviving officer of the 86th Regiment. However, the recommendation was downgraded to a Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor, because Morrison's actions, while heroic, had technically occurred while he was a prisoner of war, and some of his life-saving work had been on enemy soldiers. The medal citation read, in part, "For extraordinary heroism in action on April 29, 1945, in the vicinity of the Gothic Line, Italy. Private First Class Morrison, serving as a medical aidman, exposed himself repeatedly to intense enemy fire to reach and treat wounded soldiers. Despite being surrounded by enemy forces and having exhausted his medical supplies, Private First Class Morrison continued to provide medical care to 45 casualties, both American and enemy, over a period of 14 hours. His selfless dedication to preserving life, his exceptional courage under fire, and his unwavering commitment to the Geneva Convention principles reflect the highest credit upon himself and the United States Army. Morrison never spoke much about that day. He returned to the United States in August 1945, completed his pre-med studies at the University of Vermont on the GI Bill, and became a doctor specializing in trauma surgery. He worked for 40 years at Burlington Medical Center, training countless medical students and residents. Many of his students never knew he was a decorated war hero. He kept his medals in a drawer and rarely took them out. But every year on April 29th, Morrison would take the day off work. He would visit the local veterans cemetery and spend hours walking among the graves, pausing at certain stones, remembering names and faces from that day on the spine: Eddie Kowalski, Lieutenant Chen, Private Johnson, Sergeant Dawson, all the men he had saved and all the men he couldn't save. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the battle, the Army Historical Foundation commissioned a detailed study of medical actions during the Italian campaign. When researchers examined Morrison's achievements saving 31 of 37 critically wounded men in a forward aid station, under enemy fire with essentially no supplies, they concluded it represented perhaps the single most successful battlefield medical operation of the entire war. The typical survival rate for men with comparable injuries in similar circumstances was less than 40%. Morrison had achieved an 84% survival rate. How had he done it? Researchers identified several factors: his encyclopedic knowledge of field medicine, his ability to perform effective triage under impossible conditions, his improvisation when supplies ran out, and perhaps most importantly, his absolute refusal to give up on any man while they still drew breath. But Morrison himself attributed his success to something simpler. In his only recorded interview about the battle, conducted in 2002 when he was 80 years old, he said, "I wasn't trying to be a hero. I wasn't trying to win a medal. I was just trying to keep my promise. Every one of those men trusted me to take care of them, trusted me not to let them die alone, not to give up on them, not to leave them behind. How could I break that trust? They would have died for me. The least I could do was live for them." Daniel Morrison passed away in 2007 at the age of 85. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, including 11 veterans of Company B, 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment men whose lives he had saved 62 years earlier on a nameless ridge in the Italian Apennines. They stood in the rain as taps was played, these old soldiers, and every one of them saluted as Morrison's flag-draped casket was lowered into the ground. His headstone at Burlington Cemetery carries his name, his dates, and his rank, but the veterans who served with him and who he saved know the real inscription that should be there. He kept his promise. Every time, to every man. The cost of the German assault on the spine was staggering for both sides. The 232nd Infantry Division lost approximately 180 men killed and over 300 wounded in the attack losses they could not replace. The failure to hold the spine opened the door for the Allied breakthrough into the Po Valley, which in turn led to the complete collapse of German resistance in Italy. From a strategic perspective, the battle was significant but not decisive. Italy was already lost to Germany by late April 1945. But for the 45 men, American and German, who lay wounded in Morrison's cave on April 29, 1945, the battle was everything. It was the difference between life and death, between dying alone on a mountain and living to see homes and families again, between being forgotten and being saved. And the man who made that difference was an unarmed medic who weighed 160 pounds, who had never fired a shot in anger, who had no authority to command and no weapon to threaten, but who possessed something more powerful than any weapon ever forged: an unbreakable commitment to preserve life, even at the cost of his own. When one medic faced a 500-man assault, he didn't retreat. He didn't hide. He didn't prioritize his own survival. He stood his ground with nothing but courage, compassion, and an oath he refused to break. And because of that choice, 100 lives were touched, some saved, some comforted in their final moments, some enemy soldiers shown mercy when they expected none. That is the true measure of heroism. It's not the taking of life, but the saving of it. Not the glory of victory, but the quiet dignity of duty fulfilled when no one is watching. When no one would blame you for giving up, when every rational instinct screams at you to save yourself. Private First Class Daniel Morrison never considered himself a hero, but every man who walked off that mountain because of him knew differently. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life. In an age where we often doubt the capacity for human goodness, these stories remind us of what courage truly means, not the absence of fear, but the triumph of duty over fear, of compassion over convenience, of humanity over hate. The men of Company B, 86th Mountain Infantry Regiment, fought with bravery that day, but it was their medic, the one man who refused to carry a weapon, who refused to leave wounded behind, who refused to see enemies instead of patients, who showed them what it meant to truly win a battle. Remember their sacrifice, remember their courage, and remember Private First Class Daniel Morrison, who proved that sometimes the greatest warrior is the one who fights only to save lives, never to take them. Until next time, this is WW2 Secrets Reborn, honoring those who served.